This is the Jimi Hendrix Experience, better known as the Purple Haze or the Haze Dominion A4 brake set. I'm on a mission to find the best brakes around, and when I asked all of you which ones I should try next, these consistently rose to the top of the list. All of my friends that I know who have tried them have had great things to say about them, so I went out and bought a set in the iconic Purple Haze colorway. The $500 question is, can they live up to their hype? I purchased this brake set from Invisibility Bikes, a locally owned bike shop here in Metro Vancouver, and also one of the primary sponsors of this YouTube channel. Now, I have no professional affiliation with Haze, and neither them nor Invisibility are compensating me in any way for these brakes or for this review. Invisibility encourages me to speak my mind and review things as honestly and accurately as possible, so everything contained in this video is my opinion.
Haze has been in the brake game for quite a while. They started making brakes in 1956, and in 1997 they claimed to have introduced the first mountain bike hydraulic disc brake, revolutionizing the industry. This means that they have over 25 years of experience in this segment to draw upon. I'm not going to pretend that I'm old enough to be nostalgic over or even remember their earlier products, but what I can certainly do is review the product of today and see how it stacks up against the competition.
Which leads us to these brakes. These are the Haze Dominion A4 brakes that were launched back in July of 2018. That makes them almost 6 years old, which by bike industry standards is relatively ancient. But age is just a number, and the fact that these remain relatively unchanged after all that time is a testament to thoughtful design practices and a good sign that their performance may have been ahead of their time.
Haze effectively offers 4 different brakes for sale: the A4, T4, A2, and T2. The number represents the number of pistons in each caliper. The T-Series is focused on ultimate weight reduction, with features like carbon levers, titanium hardware, aluminum-backed brake pads, and extra machining time. They've managed to save just over 50 grams per side in exchange for 75 more of your freedom bucks. Most riders will likely gravitate toward the A-Series as it appears to be functionally the same at a more affordable price. One thing that I find really interesting is that Haze recommends you consider pairing a 4-piston front caliper with a 2-piston rear caliper as a way of saving weight. I really like this suggestion, as there are so many riders out there, and so many places out there in the world where you just don't need 4-piston brakes, including myself. The only other brand I know who recommends this strategy is 𝙎𝙬, and it's something that I think a lot of riders could benefit from if it were more commonplace in the industry. Another point worth noting is that Haze offers a small finger lever or SFL option for their A-Series. I've not tried this option, but it's a nice spec to have available if that's something that you're looking for. Unfortunately, you can't get them in purple, but I'd be keen to try them out someday. Today we're testing the Dominion A4s, which retail for 338 Canadian per side, which is 250 freedoms or approximately 230 euros. For comparison, this makes them slightly more expensive than Shimano XT8120s and slightly less expensive than SRAM Code RSCs, which positions these brakes as a premium offering with hopefully the premium performance to match. In their black and bronze colorways, these brakes can be purchased in short or long hose configurations. This is nice as there is a chance you won't have to trim the front hose length from the factory and could save a bit of time during setup. In the purple colorway, however, there is only a single part number for the long hose option. Since the brake levers are interchangeable between left and right, this allows Haze to keep their SKU count and therefore costs down. It's not the worst thing to force the end user to have to trim their hoses to the correct length, and I imagine that most riders will have this done by a qualified bike shop anyways. Either way, it's a sacrifice worth making in my opinion for a swappable lever design. Now it's time to talk about setup. Invisibility and specifically Master Mechanic Ben helped me set up these brakes per the detailed instruction guide and videos that Haze provides. Installing these Dominions was harder than it needed to be. Since these limited edition purple brakes only come with long hoses, both of them needed to be trimmed and bled before riding. This means that the pads had to be removed and bleed blocks inserted, which is where we ran into our first problem. On both of the calipers, the pad retention bolt that Haze calls the kingpin had seized to the point where we were beginning to round out the bolt head without the bolt even moving. We ended up having to use a heat gun to loosen up the bolts without further damage. The pads were quickly removed after by hand, so less heat had been applied than would have been generated by a sustained descent. One could be an outlier, but 2 is a trend, and home mechanics shouldn't have to use a heat gun to remove their brake pads from the factory. I find it a bit strange that there's no clip or cotter pin at the end of the pad retention bolt, so the job of securing the brake pads is purely up to bolt torque and thread locker, which is probably why Haze used a fairly aggressive thread locker straight from the factory. I've had no issues since with this bolt coming loose when riding, installing, or removing it. The Dominions use dot fluid, which is not inherently a significant pro or con for performance, but as the owner of a pet, and I assume anyone who owns small children, I am personally not a fan of it. Bleeding the Dominions was very average in terms of difficulty, complexity, and time required. One issue we did encounter with the bleeding process was that neither the master cylinder bleed port nor the syringes from their Pro Bleed kit had an O-ring to seal the connection. On the rear brake, this was not a problem, but on the front brake, when pulling a vacuum on the syringe at the master cylinder, step 9 for those counting along on Vital, a significant amount of air made its way into the syringe via this unsealed connection to the lever body. This would be a red flag for home mechanic and an easy way to get air to enter the system if you aren't careful, but thankfully Ben is a wizard at this stuff and no air entered the brake lever, giving us a solid bleed on the first attempt. An O-ring that lives on the bleed port screw, much like Shimano, is likely all that would have been required to fix this. It's a small fit and finish detail, but one that I feel is worth mentioning at this price point. The Dominion caliper also has 2 bleed ports, which in theory could allow you to get an even better bleed. We only used one because that's what is recommended in their bleeding documentation, and we found that to be sufficient. Hayes mentions that using the second one is optional, and specifically for removing air that has been introduced into the caliper from a caliper rebuild. It's a nice little detail and something that likely makes the process easier. The Dominions come with both organic and metallic brake pad options. I chose to use their metallic pads as that is what I use on every other brake set, and I typically prefer their performance characteristics. Unfortunately, these brake pads are a proprietary shape, and I can't find many third-party options available. The brake caliper design prevents these pads from being top-loaded too, though I've never found this to be an issue, as when I'm installing or removing brake pads, my wheel is always out, but based on my Maven review, this is a point worth noting that some viewers will surely care about. Hayes also doesn't make center lock rotors. I'm a center lock fan, so much to Vital's dismay, I'm not about to go out and buy a 6-bolt wheel set or adapters for a temporary brake set test. So I installed a brand new set of trusty Shimano XDR rotors that I have over 10,000 kilometers of experience with, and great success with my favorite brakes to date, the Intend Trinities. There's nothing I can find on Hayes' website that prohibits third-party rotor usage, many people don't use stock rotors anyway, and standardizing brake rotors between testing, although maybe not preferred, is still a valid approach. Keep in mind that I do this for fun and not for the money. Before we get into the detailed review, I'd like to talk a little bit about fit and finish quality. At $676, which as we recall is slightly more expensive than XT, these are not cheap brakes, but their fit and finish would not tell you that. The 2 halves of both calipers appear to be slightly misaligned and have a visible step in a few places, along with the light line not being continuous. The reservoir cap on the lever doesn't line up very well with the master cylinder body, and although this may be by design, this leaves 4 sharp corners that look quite cheap. And perhaps most puzzlingly, one of my calipers has a large machined face on the backside, where the other has an as forged face in the same location, despite being only 6 numbers apart in their sequential serial numbers. What this tells me is that the forgings likely have quite a wide manufacturing tolerance that potentially requires additional machining operations to fit into Hayes' clearance envelope. I've designed a lot of aluminum forgings in my day, and I've never seen such a drastic part-to-part variation that requires entirely different machining operations by literal serial number. Now, both SRAM and Shimano have product offerings at close to half the price of these brakes, and from what I've personally seen, both exceed this level of fit and finish quality. Now, this might not all be a big deal to you, but it's certainly worth noting at this price point. Hayes has outsourced their manufacturing to a very cheap vendor, and hopefully this is not reflective of their performance. Speaking of performance, it's time to talk about how these Dominions ride. These brakes had a very average bed-in period. Hayes recommends 50 plus stops from 24 kilometers an hour in order to reach full power. I find the plus a bit funny because I have no idea how these brakes are really supposed to feel and when to really stop testing, but the sentiment is there. My biggest bias in these brake reviews is the fact that I only weigh around 62 kilograms, and as such I was never able to fully burnish these brakes before my first ride. Thankfully, my lightweight also means that I have never glazed a set of brakes before, and the first steep on-trail lap bedded everything in nicely. I found the bite point to be a little bit softer than I would have liked, but more on that in a minute. First impressions were very positive. The lever feel was a much lighter action than I had just came from, and even a bit lighter than most of the other options that I have tried. Hayes talks a big game about these brakes being designed from the ground up with a light lever action in mind, so it's refreshing to see that translate away from marketing speak and into the real world. All other variables being equal, a lighter lever action will result in reduced rider fatigue and increased rider control. Along with a light lever force, Hayes has designed these brakes to have a minimal dead stroke. This minimizes the force required to get to the bite point, and in my experience makes the brakes a little bit more intuitive. The power delivery curve of these Dominions was also extremely intuitive, to the point where after just a few rides, I was setting personal records and even a few KOMs on trails that I had frequently ridden for the past 6 years. These brakes are linear enough that fine adjustments are not an issue when they're needed on rock rolls and wet wood, but progressive enough that you won't be squeezing on for dear life on sustained steep descents.
Now there's a joke somewhere in there about these brakes not being able to slow me down, but having to rarely think about a component like that is truly the gold standard, as it allows you to focus solely on the ride itself. Unfortunately, not everything was sunshine and rainbows though.
Approximately 4 rides into my testing, the front brakes started to make a loud howling noise under any slow speed braking. It didn't matter if they were wet, dry, hot, or cold, they were distractingly noisy until you picked up enough speed.
I'll take it.
I didn't think much of this at the time, as it didn't seem to be slowing me down at all, but it was something worth keeping an eye on. Approximately 2 weeks into the testing period, the rear brake began to exhibit the same behavior, being quite noisy under slow speeds on any dirt trails. I decided to take out the pads from both the front and rear calipers, and noticed that although the rest of the bike was dry, there was some residual wetness on the back side of the front brake pads. This was an orange flag that something could be up, so I carefully patted the wetness away and decided to pressure test the brakes overnight. I did this by cleaning the calipers with isopropyl, inserting the bleed blocks and zip tying the brake levers as tight as I could get them, and then leaving them for 24 hours with a clean white paper towel beneath both. After this test, everything seemed fine. There was nothing on the paper towels and the calipers appeared to be dry inside. So I carefully reassembled everything and took these brakes to their hardest test yet: Squamish slabs. For those who don't know, Squamish has an extremely grippy type of rock called granite, and many trails take advantage of this property and create the steepest slab trails in the world. Along with being a lot of fun, this is an abusive place for brakes. When riding at speed on dirt trails, even very steep ones, there was no major problem. But as we dropped into our first steep slab trail, I knew immediately that these brakes were contaminated. Above a certain gradient, these brakes struggled to maintain power, and I found myself having to control my speed in places where I could usually come to a complete stop with relative ease. I dialed back my riding and line choices to accommodate this reduced braking power, and by the end of the day the slabs had taken their toll, and the contamination was noticeable even on typical dirt trails. I returned home and reached out to 𝙎𝙊𝘾𝙄𝙼𝙍 warranty team, who responded very quickly and helpfully, and I derived a test that could repeatedly show where the contamination was coming from. If you remove the brake pads from the calipers and restrict the movement of 3 of the pistons, you could squeeze the lever to advance each piston individually. Conveniently, a Park Tool plastic tire lever is perfect for this job on more or less every caliper. For the rear caliper, one of the 4 pistons had noticeably more dot fluid on it than the rest. As you could see, it was visibly a different color due to the moisture on it. For the front caliper, the result was much more dramatic. 3 of the pistons remained almost completely dry, and by the 3rd repetition, one of the pistons was literally dripping wet with dot fluid. I performed this test 5 times on each of the 8 pistons, and the results were very repeatable, with 2 of the pistons consistently leaking. Although this test is not perfectly representative of riding conditions due to the piston travel distance, the degree of contamination between the 2 calipers demonstrated by this test correlates very closely with how long they took to contaminate my pads and rotors on the trail. If you've had a similar experience, I'd like to hear from you in the comments below. Having one caliper fail could be an outlier, but having both calipers leak to the point of contamination is a trend, and one that I hope is not a more widespread issue. The warranty representative was very understanding of these findings, and he agreed that something was probably up. So he issued me an RA number, and the brakes that you see here are in the mail by the time this video goes live. One thing I want to mention here is that he provided me with 2 options. He could either send me a rebuild kit free of charge and I can attempt to repair myself, or I could send him the complete brake set for replacement. I opted for the latter because life is extremely busy right now, but I really appreciate that 𝙎𝙊𝘾 offers a full rebuild kit. Right to repair is something that I am pretty passionate about, and the fact that 𝙎𝙊𝘾 offers all of the little bits available for purchase, regardless of your warranty status or availability, and provides exceptionally detailed rebuild instructions is a big deal to me. I've not quite seen this level of DIY serviceability before in the mountain bike brake space, and this would sway me as a potential customer, as these are brand values that I'd like to support. Let me know if this is something that is as important to you as it is to me.
Now I do plan to fully retest my warranty brake set to make sure that my experience with these is truly an outlier. But until then, it's time to put them through the Dale scale and compare them in the categories that we can do today in part 1.
Starting with the sandy categories in performance, the Purple Haze left a very strong first impression, but I don't feel like I can accurately score these brakes as I don't know when the contamination truly began, so we'll score this category in part 2 of this review. By the same reason, Invisibility will also be scored in part 2 of this review. Next up is Adjustability. Thankfully, 𝙎𝙊𝘾 is a neutral third party in the drivetrain category, so I wouldn't expect compatibility issues with shifters from either of the duopoly here. The Dominion A4s have a toolless reach and tooled contact adjustment. Although not the most aesthetically pleasing, the reach adjustment dial is very functional even when keeping your gloves on. The contact adjustment is a little bit more work since you'll need an Allen key to use it, and I found myself dialing it all the way in or out, whichever led to the least dead stroke travel, and then just leaving it there. The 2-bolt bar clamp is less convenient than the single hinged bolt clamps found on other brake sets, but at least the bolts have hex heads and normal threads, unlike the deck screws with Torx heads that Magura uses. The crosshair caliper alignment system is certainly neat in theory, but I think it's trying to solve a problem that doesn't really exist, which is why I largely skipped over it in the setup section of this video. If the caliper was sprung against the set screws, then it would work as intended, at the expense of some more complexity, but the fact that you have to preload the caliper against the set screws by hand makes it more of a hassle than it's worth in my opinion. Setup was just ultimately faster and easier without it. I've never read about any failures in this location due to the reduction of material on the caliper body near the mounting surface, so I suppose it still is a net positive feature. The one other downside here is that 𝙎𝙊𝘾𝙄𝙼 chose to go with a proprietary brake pad design for their Dominion lineup. Their in-house brake pads are quite good, but if you enjoy tinkering with your brake pad setup, then third-party options are extremely limited here, and you better hope that 𝙎𝙊𝘾 continues to support this standard with enough inventory whether or not the next generation of their brakes utilize it. There are highs and lows in this category, so we'll average them out at a 5 out of 10 for adjustability. Next we have Versatility, which is a measure of how well these brakes would perform in different categories of mountain biking. I've seen the Dominions on trail bikes, enduro bikes, and even downhill race bikes. Honestly, if they're good enough for high-level riders like Steve Vanderhoek, who consistently ride the steepest rock rolls on the planet with absolute confidence, then they're good enough for the rest of us. The A4 model in particular won't be winning any weight competitions though, and I'm sure that 𝙎𝙊𝘾 would be the first to suggest that their T2 or even A2 brakes are better suited for cross-country applications, or for those who live near less mountainous terrain. For the majority of riders, however, these A4 brakes strike an excellent balance that scores them a very respectable 8 out of 10 for their versatility. Next up we have Reliability, and my experience with these brakes seems to be an outlier, but only time will tell how my warranty brake set will perform. Therefore, it's only fair that I wait until part 2 of this review to score this category. Next we have Serviceability. Installation was harder than it needed to be. Both pad retention bolts were seized into both calipers to the point where we had to start using a heat gun to avoid rounding out the hex heads entirely. One could be an outlier, but 2 is a trend, it's kind of the quote of this video, and a home mechanic shouldn't have to use a heat gun to remove their brake pads from the factory. I'm not going to dock too many points here as I removed these and installed them several times afterwards, and have had absolutely no issue since. As someone who owns a pet, and for those who own small children, working with dot fluid is simply less enjoyable than mineral oil, especially as the cost of living crisis in Canada forces people into smaller and smaller spaces. But 𝙎𝙊𝘾 has a commendable pro right to repair stance. They offer rebuild kits available for purchase directly from their website, along with detailed exploded views and instructions for rebuilding both their levers and calipers. I would go as far as saying that 𝙎�㽗𝑧 is a category leader in this regard, and if you value being able to repair things yourself, then you know that they're a brand worth supporting. Flip-flop lever design is also great. Being able to buy one lever and then decide later which side it gets installed onto is awesome, as it helps to reduce the manufacturing and overhead cost of the product, and reduces the number of spares that both you and the bike shops would need to carry. Side-specific levers, in my opinion, should be a thing of the past. If these brakes used mineral oil and had an O-ring to seal the connection between the syringe and the lever during the bleed process, then I would score these brakes a perfect 10 out of 10 for serviceability. But in my opinion, both of these 2 points are worth docking a point for, which brings them down to a still very impressive 8 out of 10 for serviceability. This brings the Dominion score in the 3 Sendy categories we can review today up to a 21 out of 30. Now it's time to move on to the trendy categories, because ultimately mountain biking is a fashion-based industry. First up we have the wow factor, and the purple 𝙎�㗍𝑧 score very highly here. Not only are they a pleasant assault on your eyeballs, but they seem to have the performance to back up their bold looks too. A quick invitation to squeeze the lever will leave many surprised at just how light a brake lever can feel, and a firmer squeeze will reveal loads of predictable power. They aren't the craziest, rarest, or most shocking brake set around, but initial impressions are excellent in almost every category, and they pass the parking lot test with flying colors. They're a bit too common to get a perfect score in this category, but they're on par with the Mavens and score an 8 out of 10 for their wow factor. Next up we have styling, and let's start at the caliper side. Aside from its brilliant color, I find the industrial design of the caliper to be exceedingly average. Without the anodized branding and crosshair alignment system, there's nothing that sets the caliper apart visually from all the other options on the market. As I mentioned before, fit and finish is not the Dominion's strong suit. Despite having the same skew, both front and rear calipers that I tested have different machined versus forged faces, and neither have their 2 halves perfectly aligned. This is also shown on their product page, so I have good reason to believe that I am not an outlier in this regard. Next, let's move up to the levers. These levers are an excellent example of a company prioritizing function over fashion. There's nothing wrong with that, but I'm just not a big fan of how these levers look. The 2-bolt bar clamp feels a bit antiquated, and the large, smoothly contoured reservoir body with soft radii throughout do not give the Dominions the impression of quality that I feel they deserve, and from the people that I've asked, most tend to agree with me here. The fit and finish on the lever is also not great, with sharp edges protruding from most corners of the reservoir cap, since they don't fit the body as well as some of the other brands. I have no doubt that these brakes were manufactured from datums on functional surfaces rather than aesthetic surfaces, so I don't expect there to be deviations in performance as much as aesthetics, which is what I believe the compromise that 𝙎𝙊 chose to make. All of that being said, the Dominions are offered in 3 colors, and there's nothing mountain bikers like more than a nice purple anno. It's funny how some things just never change. The purple option brings the score up a few points, and the fit and finish bring it right back down, landing in the middle at a 5 out of 10 for styling. If the fit and finish is improved in future batches, then I'd be more than happy to bump this up 1 or 2 points accordingly. Next up we have the core factor, which is a measure of how cool the community thinks these brakes are. Based on the number of you who have asked me to test and review these brakes, it is pretty clear that 𝙎𝙊 is once again pretty cool, and their marketing department is definitely doing something right. All but one of the comments that I've received about these brakes have been overwhelmingly positive, which is something that I rarely see in the mountain bike industry, especially the brake category, and even more rarely in the YouTube comment section. Now, I'm not old enough to comment on whether or not 𝙎𝙊 made cool brakes back in the day, so I can only go off what I perceive to be the current community perception. The Dominions deserve a high score here, tied for the highest I have ever awarded at a 9 out of 10 for their core factor. And finally, we have value. Value is not simply performance divided by price. It is the sum of all the parts, taking into account everything that I have mentioned throughout this review. Since I've abstained from scoring a few of the previous categories, and ultimately I don't know at which specific point my brakes became contaminated, I'm going to have to wait until part 2 of this review year. This brings the total trendy score up to a 22 out of 30. Add them all up and the total is 43 out of 60, which placed the purple 𝙎𝙊 here among other brakes that I've reviewed in these categories. In the trendy categories, the Dominions place mid-pack, largely due to their unoffensive but also uninspired styling. The Sendy categories are much more interesting, however, with the A4s in a 5-way tie for first place. I have a good feeling that these brakes will score very highly in 3 of the 4 categories that I've skipped today, so we'll have to wait and see which brake ends up on top in part 2.
So where does this all leave us today? Well, 𝙎𝙊 is doing a lot of things right here, both with their Dominion A4s and as a company in general. They demonstrate a clear understanding of how brake design plays an important role in reducing rider fatigue. They have an impressively pro right to repair stance for a major player in the bike industry, and their marketing obviously works due to how highly requested this review was. Until my set leaked to the point of contamination, I had basically only positive things to say about its performance, invisibility, and value. Hopefully my experience is an outlier, but we will test that out soon. These brakes have a very light lever action, intuitive power curve, and an eye-searingly epic purple anno, all of which make me excited to get testing again. If the second set ends up being more reliable, then these will almost certainly secure a podium spot on the 𝙎𝙊 scale, and ultimately my recommendation to you. So stay tuned for round 2, and maybe even some new exciting products in between.